The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So I'm going to be talking about being overwhelmed. And is this a little... I feel like I'm getting a bit of feedback here with the microphone. Anyway. And I'd like to share some thoughts with you about it. The feeling of being overwhelmed came up for me when I was at Compassionate Friend Hermitage a few weeks ago. And when I'm at the Hermitage, I do extra meditation, and I start to feel more open and more sensitive. And I don't listen to the news or get on the internet or anything like that. And then a couple days before I was coming back, I decided to listen to the news. And Hurricane Ida had just happened, and they said they were going to be out of power for a month, and they had a rise in COVID cases in Louisiana, and this was only one of many very sad stories. And because I was feeling more open, the grief of it all seemed overwhelming. And the question arose, how could one hold it all? At that time, it felt like too much to bear. And I don't know if some of you feel that way sometimes when you hear about what's going on in the world. Sometimes you're just at that state where it's just, how do we bear this much suffering? And of course we don't always feel this way, but sometimes it just hits us. And it's helpful not to run away from this grief. And it's also helpful not to let it throw us into despair and despondency. And here's what Reverend Master Ji says about this in Roar of the Tigress, Volume 2. This is her chapter on the great ocean of meditation. It's very humbling to realize how great the design of the universe is, because it is not fully comprehensible by any of us. But one can have some glimpse of the colossal size of it, and how important and benevolent it actually is. Yes, all the suffering does go on an individual level, or so it seems, and so long as our faith stays true, we can help that suffering by staying within the third position. That does not mean that we become cold-hearted. It doesn't mean that we become non-compassionate. It doesn't mean we can't grieve. The Zen master can both grieve and cry, but his grief does not overwhelm him so that he is incapable of acting, because he himself or she is rooted in faith and meditation. And the same can be true of every monk and layperson. If you are rooted in faith and living in the third position, then when the horrors of stupidity and ignorance come, you will not be overwhelmed by the suffering. Instead, you will want to renew your own efforts, both at helping and strengthening your own faith, and in helping and strengthening the faith of others. If your faith is rooted in this place, in the living meditative state that bears the seal of the ocean, then although there will be grief, although there will be pain, it will be bearable, and we will not be so caught up in the emotionalism of the moment that we do not know what to do to alleviate the pain of self and others. We will, in fact, because we are not caught up in that emotionalism, be the most effective people possible. You must accept that, whilst we remain within this body, whilst the elements coalesce together, life will be painful. What we need to know is that we can sit still beneath it. The Zen master does not offer you magic that will turn off the pain of the world. He or she does show you how you can sit still beneath that pain so that you can help the world to make itself less painful. If you wish to think of this as magic, you may, but it isn't. It's very hard work. And that's how it's done, by sitting still in the place of meditation and allowing the essence to flow through you. Well, you may not always feel the essence flowing through you when you're feeling the suffering of the world, but you can trust. You can sit still and trust that you can sit still within the suffering, and that it will pass, and that you can really work on your training no matter what is going on in the world. So when the experience of the grief of the world or of your own grief, that is the time to trust and deepen your faith, to have the courage not to turn away, but to meditate within this grief, as Reverend Master Ji says, knowing that it will pass. One time, when something was happening in this country that seemed unbearable to me, and I won't say what it was, I found myself starting to meditate and becoming very still, and I felt connected to everyone else who was suffering. And although it was a very painful time, there was something very positive in that experience of interconnectedness. So sometimes when the suffering of the world hits us, we also feel that interconnectedness with all other beings who are suffering. I was talking to one of our OBC monks about being overwhelmed by grief, and because I was thinking about this talk, and she had also just done a talk. I had a discussion on that topic. She said she was feeling cranky and tired and just plain blah, and she realized it was because she was resisting the grief that was surrounding her. There were forest fires. The pandemic was still going on, the sadness of life, the craziness of the world, and then there was the recent loss of two of our older monks. And so she drove out to a lake, and she said in the expansiveness of nature, she allowed the grief to flow through her and to be accepted. And then her energy came back and she could carry on. So this is an example of how it helps not to run away, but to see that we can handle it, that we can handle this grief. In the Book of Joy, which we've talked about before and some of you are aware of, it's a book which is a week of dialogues with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. There is a chapter called Despair. The world is in such turmoil. And the question is asked, how can I find joy in the midst of such large world problems? And both the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu have experienced great suffering. The Dalai Lama for the people of Tibet, and Desmond Tutu for the people of South Africa. And they have both been able to handle it because of their deep faith and their spiritual practice, and sometimes it has been difficult. And I'll read you one, I don't know, maybe this is kind of depressing, but it's I'll read you one example from Desmond Tutu said, I weep when something has happened where I may not be able to assist. I acknowledge that it is something I can do very little about. I remember one of the times that I was quite despairing. Chris Hani was one of the most incredible young leaders. There was no doubt he was going to succeed Nelson Mandela. But then he was assassinated just before Easter, leading up to our first democratic elections. I was at the cathedral in Cape Town when I heard. I was stunned, as were most South Africans. I got back home to Bishop's Court, and Leah, that was his wife, said to me there had been many calls about Chris Hani. I broke down, and Leah held me like I was a baby. I think it helped because later on I had to go and preach at his funeral, and we had a huge crowd of people who were very, very angry. I knew how they felt because I had been through the same sort of thing, and I could appeal to them not from a superior position, but from a position of one who was with him and who had felt the same anguish and pain. So here's someone who, has incredible faith, but he still feels the suffering, and yet he got through it. And there's something in here about the Dalai Lama, where on March 10th, 2008, where there was an uprising in Tibet, and he knew that there was going to be an incredible retaliation from the Chinese, and he knew there was nothing he could do about it. And in order for the grief of this situation to not overwhelm him, this is what he did. He did something that's a Tibetan practice called Tonglen, literally meaning giving and taking. He's talking about the Chinese. I tried to take on their fear, anger, suspicion, and to give them my love, my forgiveness. Of course, this would have no physical effect on the ground. It would not change the situation, but you see, mentally, it was very, very helpful to keep a calm mind. It was a good opportunity to practice forgiveness and compassion. So I think that every person has this same sort of opportunity, this same capacity. So when we see maybe the horrors of the world or craziness going on, maybe we can offer merit, and that will help us with that situation. So, and yet both of them, both Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama, talk about the incredible goodness in the world, and they give many examples of how incredibly good people are, and that basically people are good, and that there are many, many more people who are good than are not. And they're very encouraging about all the good that's being done in the world. And at a time when things were kind of rough in this country and in the world, Rev. Master Koten started sending around emails called an affirming flame. And sometimes with lots of little links to stories often they were about people who were being incredibly kind and generous. And they had various different kinds of links. And one was to a song that was called Good People. And this, for some reason, this really stuck with me. And I'm not going to sing it, but it just goes like this. Good people aren't hard to find. They're just around the corner at the end of the line. Good people. And for some reason, that really kind of keeps coming back. Good people aren't hard to find. It's not only the suffering of the world that can be painful, but the suffering of individuals that we care about and our own suffering. Our own grief and the grief of another can seem overwhelming at times. Having faith and going on, not running away, seems to be the answer. When my cat Maisie was dying, she was in a lot of pain and seemed to be suffering deeply. It was a really difficult death. And all my life, I had been avoiding looking at suffering. But because this was my cat and I loved her, I couldn't turn away. And so I looked at her suffering and I experienced her suffering, but it wasn't overwhelming. I just experienced it. And after her death, I felt like her painful dying process had been a cleansing of her karma. And it also, her dying process made me sympathetic to people who, up until this point, I was really against people putting their animals to sleep, euthanasia. And during this time, although I didn't do it, I became very sympathetic to why people would actually do that. Now, another aspect of feeling overwhelmed is being overwhelmed by our own circumstances. Too much to do, our situation just seems too difficult, or life is uncertain, we're worried about our life and the uncertainty of it. When I have been able to catch myself, and this has come up for me recently because I was the prior for 10 days, and there was a lot to do, and it was hard to make things work, so I became I had to catch myself from getting overwhelmed. But when I could catch myself, and could just be in the moment, every time the worry or the feeling of overwhelm would arise, or the next thing I needed to sort out would arise, and I just let it go, I could be in that place of just being in the moment and of stillness, and it was okay. And I had to just do this over and over again. And it was hard work, and it took faith, but it was really worth it. And sometimes I wasn't so lucky, and I got caught up in the worry or the feeling of being overwhelmed and was run around by it. And it can just be painful just to be still with these feelings of being overwhelmed or worried or whatever is arising at the time, or what these feelings are bringing up. But believe me, it's better to let these things arise and pass than to give in to the worry and overwhelm. So we can't sit still in the midst of whatever is going on, and just let these things arise and pass, and just trust in the moment. Sometimes when I do get overwhelmed, I ask for help. And I very often turn to Avalokiteshvara and I just say, please help me. And sometimes I turn towards the Dharma and read something that inspires my faith. Overwhelm or worry can run us around, or can be opportunities to practice having faith in being in the moment, trusting in the moment, entrusting ourselves to the great matter for which we train, as Reverend Master Mahan often says. Sometimes that's all we can do. And sometimes for me, overwhelm has to do with unwillingness. I've been trying harder recently to say yes to whatever is asked of me, to respond to what is good to do and not to do what I necessarily want to do. So just to say yes, and to really listen to what is being asked of me, what is good to do. And then sometimes there's just one more thing that's being asked, and that pushes me over the edge, and I'm overwhelmed. And I see that, and then I see that it really didn't have to. That I can say yes, and that I can look at what the situation is bringing up in me. And I have to say, with the ideal comes the actual. I don't always do the ideal. I don't always succeed, and sometimes it's good to say no. And I'd like to end with an example of not being overwhelmed. And this is an article by Reverend Master Koten, the prior of Lionsgate Buddhist Priory. He gave a talk called Return to the Mountain, and then it became an article in his journal. And I would like to read it. It's pretty short, and it's a really nice article about not being overwhelmed, not becoming overwhelmed. So he says, as most of you know, we were evacuated from our land at the end of June, and we returned home yesterday, which is the 25th of August, Wednesday. So for almost 2 months, we have been evacuated away from the temple, not knowing whether or not there would be a temple to come back to, given the fierceness of the fires in the area. As most of you would have heard, the town, which is our town, burned to the ground, along with all the amenities and support services, stores, schools, libraries, museums, etc., all gone. For the past almost 2 months, we have lived out of hotels and people's houses, for which we are very grateful, and we are grateful to have survived the fire with ourselves and our pets, 2 dogs and a cat, intact, because many of our friends and neighbors lost everything in this fire. Trying to maintain religious life in the middle of what we went through has been very difficult. It is a bit different even than the wandering from place to place that they did in early Buddhist times. We were very much struck on the cusp of not knowing what will happen at all, or as I say, whether or not there was something to go back to. We experienced this before when we had to evacuate Botany Valley in 2014. We were evacuated then for about a week, so at least we had some idea of what to prepare for. And also, while we were in Lillooet, there was an evacuation alert there as well, so we had to prepare to leave at a moment's notice. Through all of this, we, as well as everybody else, have relied upon the kindness of friends and neighbors and the support of strangers. Numerous people have been very helpful. When training is stripped down to the bare essentials, as I think it often is with people who are very, very busy with jobs or with their children, then it has to come down to one's intention, and to not forget to neglect one's intention to train oneself, and to turn towards that, and not become discouraged. Because, of course, discouragement is a common feature of being in the type of circumstances we have been in. In the middle of all this, one of our members had to be taken to the hospital to check for a possible stroke. It turned out not to be a full-blown stroke, but a minor transient one, for which we are very grateful. While he was being taken to the hospital, I was sitting in Lillooet, when suddenly there came a phone call and email to let me know that Lillooet was on evacuation alert. So I went about gathering up the things that we could take with us. I phoned one of our neighbors from the Botany Valley, and they said they would take us because I can't drive. And as I went about trying to get together those things that were essential, I also had the dog and the cat. And not wishing to obviously overburden somebody who is about to take you, your belongings, dog and cat, with them in evacuation, I was trying to get everything down to the minimum of what is necessary for continuing the priory. Never mind personal things, which often are, or I found were not my priority. As I was doing this, knowing that one person was in the helicopter on the way to Lionsgate Hospital, and another person was on their way through the bucketing rain on a 4-hour drive to Vancouver to be with them, and here I am in Lillooet under evacuation alert, the sheer ridiculousness of the situation struck me, and I burst out laughing. Ridiculous in the sense of the law of the universe, which says that the universe is beyond our personal control, really came home, and how much the situation was totally beyond my control, and how much we were relying upon the kindness of strangers, the support of people. As it turned out, Lillooet was not evacuated, but it was on alert for quite a long time, until we had heavy rains, and in the Botany Valley as well, which has dampened down the fire danger, at least in this area. It was important during that period of time to not allow oneself to get into apocalyptic mode, that is, everything is going wrong, and just to succumb to that state of mind. Perspective under those circumstances helps. As I said, support from friends and neighbors and strangers helps. Also that having other people with you, or a pet, helps, as we have proved true for ourselves. The monk Ryokan used to say, when you are someone who is encountering an earthquake, be that person. Be the person who is encountering an earthquake. I think one aspect of this means that such an encounter produces an effect on body and mind, independent of one's will, in the same way as if one were to receive a physical injury, knowing that it is so, to be that person and not attempt to be somebody else or somewhere else. Too often when we think of our lives, our body and minds and lives, we think that the purpose of our lives is to preserve these intact, but that isn't really so. Our bodies and minds will wear out in the course of things. The question is whether we wear them out in training, whether we wear them out in the most useful way, in the cleansing of karma, in the being of benefit to others, in giving, in cultivating a generous frame of mind. Then when we do this, our lives become worthwhile. And then when we pass away, there will remain the scent of incense. Now I love this section where he says he laughed at the ridiculousness of the whole thing. And I have to say, in one sense, that's really a gift, because we hold on to everything so tightly, and we try and make everything work out as we would like to work it out. And then here he is in this situation where nothing is he can't hold on to anything. And yet he just lets it all go. And he just has to trust in the kindness of strangers and just go with the situation. So I just love that aspect. And almost it's a gift to just have to let it all go. And anyway, that's my talk. That's my talk for today. Thank you.